Welcome to the Belly Button Window channel and episode 47 of the Jimi Hendrix story, like you've never heard it before. In this episode, we explore the aftermath to Jimi's death, featuring the immediate impact, the press reaction, and including the funeral and wake. Please remember to subscribe and check the channel's community tab and video information page, where you will find links to related videos, performances, and stunning photographs from the period. After having left the speakeasy at approximately 4 a.m., Mitch Mitchell recalled, "I drove back to my house about an hour and a half's drive. I remember having this odd feeling when I left that was hard to define. I didn't go to bed and sat up for what seemed like a few hours, but may well have been longer. I'm not sure of the time, but I got a call from Eric Barrett telling me that Jimi had died. I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't release any emotion at all. I finally got some sleep about 6 the next night, but waking up later it was a bit like, did I dream that? Again, I woke up thinking, was that the truth? And of course, sadly, it was. I couldn't handle it at all." While Noel Redding remembered, "As I lay struggling through the aftermath of a heavy night on the town, the phone in my New York hotel room insisted on waking me. 'Hello, a friend of yours is dead.' 'Oh yeah, who's that?' 'Hendrix.' I hung up, numbed. 1,000 thoughts and feelings flooded my head. Was this a joke? If so, it wasn't funny. He couldn't be dead. People don't die when they're only 27. Jimi was the first person I was close to, my first intimate friend, to die. Suddenly I felt mortal and very alone. The next few hours were unreal. The phone rang unceasingly. Girls pounded on my door crying and hoping to commit suicide from my hotel room window. I was forced to leave for privacy and sanity's sake, and was drawn, unexpectedly for me, into a church. More expectedly, I then gathered up the ladies, took them to a bar and began to get drunk." According to Sharon Lawrence, in New York, Bob Dylan burst into tears when he was told that Jimi was dead. An anguished Eric Clapton cried out, "No, not Jimi! I wish it could have been me, not him." The London daily newspapers ran Mick Jagger's reaction as a front-page headline, "I am shattered." Chas Chandler had travelled up north to Newcastle the day of Jimi's death. His father met him at the train station to break the news. Chas, like Mitch and Noel, suffered immense shock and pain. Dick Katz, Jimi's London agent, who so deeply believed that Hendrix's talent put him in the category of genius, said to me, "This is the greatest tragedy I can think of." Lawrence goes on to point out that, for Jimi's admirers, news of his death was a landmark moment of grief and shock. Hendrix? No, the news reports couldn't be true. There must be a mistake. It was as if the sun had been ripped from the sky. Impossible for weeping young people around the world. The loss of 27-year-old Jimi Hendrix on September 18th, 1970, represented a cruel, crushing end of innocence. Harry Shapiro noted that, at 2 p.m., BBC Radio 1 reported, "Jimi Hendrix, regarded by millions as one of the most talented and original performers in modern rock music, is dead." The news flashed around the world. Jimi Hendrix dies at 24, overdose. Jimi Hendrix in London overladen. Jimi Hendrix, rock star, is dead in London at 27. More do guitarist, pop Jimi Hendrix. Reverential obituaries followed quickly in both the mainstream and music press. That evening, Michelle Lydon, writing for the New York Times, described Hendrix as a genius black musician, a guitarist, singer, and composer of brilliantly dramatic power. He spoke in gestures as big as he could imagine and create. His willingness for adventure knew no bounds. He was wild, passionate, and abrasive, yet all his work was imbued with his personal greatness. He was an artist extravagantly generous with his beauty. For the more sober-minded London Times, Jimi was simply a key figure in the development of popular music, who was largely responsible for whatever musical metamorphosis pop music has undergone in the last 3 years. There were several personal tributes from journalists who had followed Jimi from his earliest days in New York and London. The praise was fulsome and generous, the sadness tangible. Most were at pains to point out how much of a hype the wild man of pop image really was, and how fame had not changed his personality over the years. Under the banner headline, "Gentleman Jimi, Inventor of Psychedelic Pop," Mike Ledgerwood wrote for Disc and Music Echo, "Despite his fame and fortune, plus the inevitable hang-ups and hustles which beset his incredible career, he remained a quiet, almost timid individual. He was naturally helpful and honest, answering questions, somewhat reluctant to talk about himself, yet always excited about his music. Bob Dorban of Sounds found a man of quite remarkable charm, an almost old-world courtesy and quite overpowering personality, while Richard Green, who also did PR for Jimi, expressed the feelings of many in his tribute. Everyone who knew Jimi is still sad and numb. They have lost a friend. It is hard, too, for the fans, who will never be able to see him again. Only his memory and his music live on as an everlasting monument to a truly great man of music and person. But perhaps the most poignant observation was made by another good friend, Keith Altham, when he wrote that the contradiction between Jimi on and off stage was further emphasized by his close friends, who often referred to him as Hendrix rather than Jimi. While John McDermott pointed out that the Fleet Street Press had a field day with Hendrix's death, blazing headlines informing readers of the wild man of pop's lurid personal life. So cleverly manipulated by Jeffrey and Chandler during Hendrix's lifetime, the newspapers, true to form, now seemed bent on destroying his memory. Further damaging Hendrix's reputation was Eric Burdon's bizarre revelation that Jimi had committed suicide. In an interview broadcast on September 21st with Kenneth Allsop for the BBC television programme 24 Hours, Burdon described Hendrix's death as deliberate, citing a poem Hendrix had allegedly crafted the evening before his death. Burdon's comments caused a firestorm in Britain and abroad, increasing the already intense scrutiny and speculation over the final sketchy hours of Hendrix's life. In addition, Burdon's allegations temporarily jeopardized the Lloyd's of London insurance payout to Warner Brothers, while Burdon would later repudiate his suicide claim, citing in his own autobiography the Allsop interview as a regretful, shameful exercise. His initial claim ignited a destructive thought process that dramatically shaped the posthumous Hendrix legend. Noel Redding stated that, during our touring days, there were times when we discussed our deaths and how we wanted them to be. Jimi had always said he wanted to be buried in England, where he had been given a chance, and made it. Jimi's family had brought the body home to Seattle, but they had control over very little else. I'd only met Jimi's father a few times and found him to be a gentle and sincere person. Too nice to be confronted with this freak scene. It was bad enough to lose your son, without having the tragedy commemorated with a circus. Jimi had been away for such a long time. Suddenly he was a star, and suddenly he was dead, and all these vultures were hanging around trying to be photographed with the family. As next of kin, Jimi's dad became surrogate star. How could he hope to cope? Nearly 2 weeks after his death in London, Jimi Hendrix was back in Seattle, his hometown, to be buried. The results of the inquest had been relayed from London. It was an open verdict, in every sense of the word, but at this time, nobody was really concerned with how he died anyhow. The reality of the present situation, Jimi's funeral, said all that seemed to be said. Hendrix's funeral was held on Thursday, October 1st, at Dunlap Baptist Church, on Seattle's Rainier Avenue South. The church itself was very simple, even dull. A small building, the chapel had no stained glass windows. At the front were the pulpit, the coffin, and a floral arrangement dominated by a large and striking guitar. In the morning, parties of Jimi's friends and acquaintances flew in from New York, Los Angeles and London. John Hammond, Johnny Winter, Steve Paul from the Scene Club, Miles Davis, Noel and Mitch, Buddy Miles, Alan Douglas, Devon Wilson, Eric Barrett, Jerry Stickles, Chuck Wine and Eddie Kramer. Just one reporter and one photographer were allowed in. Some 200 others plus local fans of Jimi stood respectfully outside behind ropes. A half-dozen police cars and about a dozen police motorcycles lined up with 24 limos standing black and silent at the curb. All of Jimi's close family were in attendance. Al, his wife June, Jimi's 9-year-old stepsister Janie, and his brother Leon. Against the backdrop of a floral arrangement dominated by a large guitar-shaped wreath, the Reverend Harold Blackburn conducted the service. Freddie Mae Gautier stepped forward to read the eulogy. She read out Angel and Jimi's own liner notes to Buddy Miles' album, Expressway to Your Skull. The Express has made the bend, he is coming on down the tracks, shaking steady, shaking funk, shaking feeling, shaking life, the conductor says, as we climb aboard. We are going to the Electric Church. The Express took them away, and they lived happily and funkily ever after, and, excuse me, I think I hear my train coming. At the end of the short service, the people filed past the open casket and out of the church. Then the pallbearers, Dave Anderson, James Thomas, Steve Phillips, Herbert Price, Eddie Howard, and Danny Howell, came out, bearing the coffin. with the exception of Price, who was Jimmy's chauffeur and valet in Hawaii this summer when a film was being made. All were friends from Jimmy's childhood, including James Thomas, who gave Jimmy his first chance in a band. From the church, the procession of perhaps 100 cars made the 20-minute drive to Greenwood Cemetery, where Lucille was buried, in nearby Renton, where, after a few more words from Reverend Blackburn, and a chorus of "When the Saints Go Marching In," Jimi Hendrix, age 27, was laid to rest. Charles R. Cross added that Michael Jeffrey had purchased the huge acoustic guitar-shaped floral display, which dominated the many arrangements. Jeffrey was also at the funeral, as were most of the band's crew and associates, along with press agent Michael Goldstein, who had to keep dispelling rumors that the Beatles were in attendance. A number of New York musicians attended, including Miles Davis, who later said he hadn't even attended his own mother's funeral. Devin Wilson flew in from New York, and Melinda Merriweather from Hawaii. Seattle Mayor Wes Ullman also attended, which itself was quite a turn of events. Sharon Lawrence noted, "The funeral took place on a chilly afternoon, and that the Dunlap Baptist Church on Rainier Avenue South was in the old neighborhood. Furthermore, Al Hendricks had made the decision that the casket should be open, in an effort to show Seattle and the world that the rock star seemingly had died of an accidental overdose and did not resemble a ravaged drug addict." While Rolling Stone wrote, it had been a hectic week in Seattle prior to the funeral. The ceremony itself had been put back a few times because the autopsy in London had been put back. Funeral arrangements, handled primarily by Michael Jeffrey, through Jimmy's father, Al Hendricks, had been sometimes chaotic, an endless series of meetings and phone calls with Seattle officials. Initially, there was talk of a huge rock and roll memorial service and jam. That was scotched quickly, partly due to lack of time to organize such an event, and partly because the city of Seattle freaked at the idea. "If we can't do it right, we won't do it at all," Jimmy's father said, and that settled that. The gathering that followed the funeral was described by many as a wake, and it was certainly closer in spirit to Jimi Hendrix than what had preceded it that day. The musical tribute was held in the Food Circus building of the Seattle Center, directly below the Space Needle left over from the World's Fair. Concert promoter Tom Hewlett had arranged for music, there was food, and the atmosphere was much lighter. The only hitch came when the program director from KOLFM, there by Hewlett's special invitation, called his station to say he'd be late for work because he was down at the Food Circus with the Hendrix family, Mitch and Noel, George Harrison, and so forth. Besides the fact that he named some personalities who weren't there, George wasn't. It went out over the air, and Hewlett spent much of the rest of the afternoon telling the hundreds who gathered outside that the Hendrix family preferred it remain a private gathering for friends and relatives. He was understandably upset that he was put in this position. The location had been kept secret to avoid just such a scene. But again, the kids understood and cooperated. Inside, the Buddy Miles Express played a full set. From there, it turned into a freewheeling jam, started off by Miles, Redding, Winter, and Hammond. Pretty soon, Mitchell took over on drums. The two guitarists fell out, and it was like that for the rest of the afternoon, with the musicians stepping in and out or trading axes. Jimmy's young cousin, Eddie Hall, displayed a fast and fluid blues guitar, and the music went on into the early evening. And Noel had this to say of the funeral: "It was a complete nightmare for me. The coffin was open. I think it's a ghastly custom. Everyone was expected to parade by and look, but I just couldn't." Mitch and I cried and held hands for strength. I looked around and was horrified. Everyone was vying for attention. Everyone had been Jimmy's best friend. Some who hadn't cared a jot for him alive came because it was the place to be seen. There were about 25 limos. The preacher went on and on when he should have just said, "We loved him. He played great guitar and gave so much, and now he's dead." His white Fender guitar should have been buried with him, but instead it disappeared. Jimmy always said he wanted a party when he died. We rented a hall, gathered up a few instruments, and gave him a good send-off. Buddy Miles, Johnny Winter, Mitch, and myself were the nucleus of a jam session that lasted hours. Jimmy would have enjoyed it. While Mitch said, "The worst thing was the funeral. It was like a circus. I flew out to Seattle with Noel, who I'd seen a few times in the last months. He hadn't seen much of Jimmy, but he had been to the opening of the Electric Lady studio, and there was still a lot of affection between all of us. It was okay until we got to the church and you realized what kind of event the powers that be had made this. I think it started to hit me during the service, especially when we had to walk up the aisle and file past the open coffin. Neither Noel nor I had ever been through anything like that before. God, it was the most awful thing. Noel and I held hands. That was when it really hit home. They'd booked the Seattle Coliseum or somewhere. For the wake, a place we'd played, certainly. It was really gauche, but probably not bad in retrospect. People got up and played. Noel and I did play later in the day, but I kept a pretty low profile and got an early flight home. Even after I got home, it was hard to accept that Hendrix was dead. It still felt like he was right here. In the end, all you can say is, what a fucking waste. He was irreplaceable, both as a friend and as a musician. There was so much more that he was capable of, and his music would have changed as with the musicians he worked with, including drummers. There is no doubt, though, that he was not simply a hard act to follow, more an impossible act to follow. That concludes this installment of the series. Stay tuned for the next episode where we will deep dive into the legal wrangling surrounding Jimmy's estate, the unreleased recordings, and much, much more. In addition, keep an eye out for updates to earlier episodes as we add new details and images to the Hendrix story, not to mention new music-related content. Don't forget to subscribe for future content updates. And by the way, if you have any photos, stories, ideas, or feedback to contribute, we would love to hear from you. Until next time.